Okay, we are here with Andy Beta, like Betamax.
Sure.
Yeah, author of this fantastic book on the wonderful Alice Coltrane. It's coming out
Yes.
actually in March 3rd on Da Capo Press. Well, let's just start before we talk about the book itself. Let's just speak a little bit about you and your background in writing and music journalism and that kind of thing.
Um, yeah, so longtime music journalist. When you mentioned that you're doing the interview and the YouTube and the PopMatters review, I was like, oh yeah, I remember, you know, the freelance hustle,
Yeah.
so to speak, of.
Well, I'm a retired publicist, so and now I'm a retired publicist and musician, so that's how I got into all this. But go ahead. So what did you?
Um,
Yeah, let's talk about your background. Some of
yeah, in college, my college roommate had a you know, kind of well-known, like kind of underground zine, and that was kind of where I got my start. And
Mhm.
then when I moved up into New York, I think about a year into that, I started writing for Pitchfork in like the early Pitchfork days.
Right, right.
Um, and then, from there, did a lot for like the Village Voice. I did a lot for Minneapolis City Pages, just all the alt weeklies, The Stranger in Seattle. Um, whatever alt weeklies in LA and San Francisco, I know I did it all. Spin, Rolling Stone, mentioning these bygone titans of the, you know,
Washington Post,
Washington
the late
Post,
great.
the late great Washington Post. Yeah. Yeah, and just I think that also kind of instilled in me this, metabolism for seeking out music as well,
Right.
because you're always trying to go beyond what the hype is and be like, well, what's something that I can find that no one else is talking about?
Well, I think you really did with this book, because I think it was kind of very timely with the sort of there is an Alice Coltrane Renaissance, and when I read your book, I was realizing that she kind of did suffer a little from the Yoko syndrome. I want to separate the Yoko. I spoke with David Sheff, who wrote the recent book about her. I'm not a
Hmm.
huge fan of Yoko as the musician, but Yoko the
Hmm.
artist, I'm a huge fan of. So Alice, you really delve in this book, not only into her life and her whole musical progression, but the whole spiritual side of this woman. And then the side of her as as a feminist, as a woman who's, widowed with four very young children. She's got to not only parent the children, but she's got to parent this huge legacy of John
Hmm.
and have her own musical career. But let's just go back to the beginning. Let's talk about her beginnings coming out of the Detroit scene, the influence the church had on her music, and her connection to a lot of the music, the jazz scene in Detroit. The Joneses and Lateef and Burrell and Joe Henderson, and also some other names like the Motown folks and Aretha
Hmm.
Franklin. So you have a little background on her early years.
Um, you know, in kind of the introduction to the book, I mentioned these other folks in the ashram who have gone on and published their own books,
Hmm.
because this isn't the first book on her. It's,
Hmm.
by my count, like the third or fourth maybe.
Hmm.
Um, but very, very little in those books is about Detroit and her upbringing.
Hmm.
Um, and there wasn't really a lot of, in her story, in the few interviews she did, she doesn't always talk that much about that aspect, those young years.
Hmm.
Um, so that was, I think, one of the challenges in the book was what can I find about this era of Detroit and about her and that upbringing. Um, and that was a pretty heavy lift, I think. That was where we required just like a lot of research and, you know, looking up books on, there's a crucial book that's like pre-Motown Detroit music, and that
Hmm.
was like a really like vital resource for me to, you know, see this like, very vibrant scene. It's it's kind of this curious thing about jazz in that you really had to be in New York to make it and to be recorded and to be on these jazz labels or whatever. But every major US metropolis had a scene, like Charlie Parker's coming out of a Kansas City scene,
Right.
or, Count Basie, and, there's things in Chicago, there's things in, Los Angeles,
Hmm.
Seattle, also had like a
Hmm.
vibrant, Philadelphia, like they all had these like scenes,
Right.
but, unless they got all the way and graduated to the Big Apple and
Right.
recorded, that stuff gets lost to history. And
Right.
so that was a very fascinating part of the research for me was like going in and just looking at, what's in Detroit, and just really kind of understanding how strong the Detroit music scene, the jazz scene was. And I
Right.
think,
Hmm.
as you sort of mentioned, like, you know, because the schools were integrated, which is already just, a very rare thing in the United States, right? That
Hmm.
the black children and the white kids, they're all learning, similarly, they're getting a good education. Um, and to our listening benefit, they had got a strong musical education.
Right.
Um, and because of that, you had this really solid foundation just for like just players, like, orchestral play.
Who were some of the players? I mean, in terms
Well,
of
yeah,
jazz that
you
you came
mentioned,
up.
you mentioned some of it because it's like, and a lot of it was like, and I think it's mentioned in the book as well. It was almost like the salon culture. You have
Hmm.
like these families of kids, and there's like three or four kids who are all playing. So it's like the Burrell family, the Jones family. I mean, to think of Elvin Jones as like the baby of the family and probably not even like the best musician in his own family
Yeah, I think you
is,
also referenced that they because of the economy at that time, Southern blacks coming up and getting good jobs in in the auto industry, people actually had houses. They weren't in apartments, so
right.
these kids, including her, they had this salon culture where they would could just jam and,
Hmm.
not be told to, shut up.
Right. And I think also, one of the aspects of jazz is like, oh, drugs and prostitution and liquor
Mhm.
and stuff like that. So you're trying to nurture these kids, so they're just playing at home with their friends, right? They don't have
Right,
to go and be at a bar till 3 o'clock in the morning at, the age of 15.
right.
They're allowed to just do this music, in the comforts of home. And I think one of the other things is not only do you have that, but you also have like a really strong mentorship in like
Hmm.
Detroit where there's these Monday nights and like here are these established guys playing,
Right.
but they're bringing up, the high school kids and being like, come on up and,
Yeah.
let's jam on a tune.
Well, in terms of mentorship, you also talk about in the book about her time as a church player, and that
Hmm.
was her mother was actually involved in playing in churches. So, and that's that sort of gospely type vibe was present even in the end when she was kind of fusing it with Eastern. So, if you want to talk a little bit about that,
About the church.
yeah.
I guess one of the things, in talking about, this aspect of Detroit in the research was just how much you could kind of see, because I did a lot of just like newspaper research in
Hmm.
Detroit, and just, one, how vital media is in terms of like just the amount I learned about what was going on at Mount Olive Baptist Church week in, week out. Like
Right.
it was just really remarkable. And I don't, even with the internet, I don't think, if I was trying to
Yeah.
document someone in the 2000s in terms of church and community, like you just don't have that. Like you don't have that
You
access.
go to
Like,
the microfiche.
yeah, it was just like astonishing for me that I could like get into like the 1930s and 1940s of, Black Detroit and just really see the in and out like aspects of what's going on in the church. I mean, there's like announcements when she's just doing like a piano recital as like,
Mhm.
like a 11-year-old or 13-year-old. And I mean, it's astonishing to me. Like I could see like the whole program for what she was
Right.
playing at this church. Like,
Mm.
so that was like a really kind of like fascinating for me insight into her and those roots. Because yeah, you can be like, yes, the gospel aspect, but to see like the classical music training she was also getting
Right.
and
And
like the
yeah,
pieces she's learning in that regard.
well, and then you also mentioned that, Barry Harris was very present there, the great jazz educator, and
Hmm.
one of her influences was one of the early pianist, Terry Pollard, right? So which
Right.
got her into the Gibbs in with Terry Gibbs.
Yeah. Yeah, the Terry Pollard thing, also in this like mentorship sort of way.
Hmm.
Her family like upgraded the piano. Alice, they didn't even have a piano in the house, and
Right,
here's Terry Pollard being like, here you go, like here's a piano for your house, which obviously has a huge influence on Alice, but also her youngest sister, Marilyn McLeod, who
right,
would go on to be like a famed, successful Motown songwriter, right?
right.
And
Well, again, as we were saying earlier, that there was a connection to both. Berry Gordy was a neighbor, right?
mhm. Yeah, like
And Aretha,
Catty
and
Corner.
yeah,
Yeah. And the Aretha, it's a little bit of a reach, but only because, I could just gain insight from Aretha's telling of her childhood and have like
mm,
an approximation. I think age-wise, Alice is probably closer to like Carolyn Franklin, but
mhm.
is there a Carolyn Franklin biography? Like probably not, but here's Aretha who's telling her story. And you can kind of see, these sort of parallels. And same with like, Barry is obviously like the closest example because they're both in kind of like Paradise Valley, Black Bottom, a working
Right,
class black neighborhood
right.
and, that kind of stuff. So
And he
there's
dated
just,
her, and he dated her sister, you said, right?
yeah, he did his sister.
So he was at the house, showing.
Yeah, and same with like, Terry Pollard's dating her half brother, Ernie Farrow.
Right,
Um, and it was one of the things I liked about in the book was I get to kind of tell some other stories beyond hers, right? Because
right.
there's just times where you don't know her whole story and you can't
Mhm.
tell it, but telling the Terry Pollard story and her appearance on like the Tonight Show or the Jack Parr show, or whatever at the time, Steve Allen,
You're right.
um, like this routine they have that she would then carry on when she replaced Terry in the band, and
Right, and
yeah,
that's what brought her for the first. So that's her beginning in jazz. It really was bebop, right? Was with Terry Gibbs,
right.
and
That was like her breakout, but she also had just like her own thing she was doing there,
right,
right? Um, and that's, and one of the things, and also when I'm, talking about the research of like the Detroit papers and those sorts of groups is I sort of, I guess, deduced when Alice was in New York because there's this gap where she's just not in the Detroit paper like at
wow.
all. She's not at a nightclub, she's not at church. And it's being like, oh, this must have been when she was in New York, and you know, doesn't really turn up in like the Amsterdam news of New York, but that's when she would have been here in that sort of way.
And
But
that was her first real. So she comes to New York with Terry Gibbs. Now she was married. Her first husband. Let's talk about him, and then how they ultimately ended up in Europe for a brief time.
yeah, and that's a difficult one because she herself barely mentioned this marriage. Kenny Haggard, struggled with drugs most of his life and career, so he doesn't really talk about it either. And even in the times when I like spoke with her daughter, like I don't think he was talked about much as well. So that was a very, kind of nebulous sort of space, especially, they're in Paris. So it wasn't like there wasn't much info to kind of glean from like the time in Paris or
Right.
whatever. But yeah, so some of that is sort of just speculation. But then it is almost this minor miracle that you can find footage online of her at Le Blue Note in Paris,
Right.
you know, playing straight bebop, with like Kenny Clark and all those sorts of folks. And, you know,
So when
like
does
the
she?
things you do find is kind of amazing.
So when does John enter the picture? There's a brief there. When does all that develop as a couple? I mean,
It's interesting because it was, first of all, you have John as like a jazz star. So
Hmm.
she just knows him from like his playing or whatever. And then this is when John is kind of coming into his own as well, right? He's kicked drugs. He's kind of had this like spiritual, not so overt at that point, but just like he's really taken interest in these other cultures and these other musical styles. And it was just really fascinating, like when Benny Maupin talked about just being at her house and they're listening to Africa Brass and like really getting into Africa Brass and going to see him play and this is maybe an aspect for some people, who listen to John's music, who
Hmm.
listen to Alice's music, and and they hear something else in it, right? They hear like something else that's coming through.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, sure, it's modal and it's staying in this thing, but John's really kind of like conveying this other message that she's hearing.
Right.
And I mentioned in the book these other people who, you know, become like spiritual students of hers that they listen to the music and they hear something else
Right.
that's being, transmitted in it. And so I thought that was like a really fascinating aspect. And then, yeah, it was just, you know, it's funny because that first part of the book is, it's like a survey of like Detroit jazz of that era and
Hmm.
also like, kind of like the civil rights struggle and, the racial strife of that
The
era.
riots, the riots.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
riots and then, you know, John enters the picture like 100 pages in and then it's like this love story, right? It's like
Right.
I had to like completely shift
Well, you
the
did. You
book.
talked about the meeting. I guess their first meeting was at Birdland. This was before they really
Mhm.
got together, and he played always for her. The
Yeah, and that was another thing in the research that was like I heard he's playing this melody for her, like what is it? What is it? And then I think in the research it was, just some interview in like the 80s or the 90s, or it was like a very late thing that she finally is like, it's like says what this is. And I was like, oh my God, like that's the song. Like I'd always heard this like, you know, apocryphal tale about, how he's walking behind her playing this song. And
Mhm.
it was kind of, a relief to be like, okay, this is the song. Like this
Oh, you
is,
yeah, you determined it. That's great. But
um,
when they first get together as a couple, um, he's still got the quartet, right? And she's more of a housewife over in
Yeah.
Dick
Yeah, and,
Sales.
and and I think, it is important to be like when they finally met, they were like instantly together.
Right.
He went full bore with it and so did she.
Yeah.
And that was, they just knew and that was it, right? And I think one of the, subtle arguments I make in the book is this idea of like, you bring up like Yoko Ono, but like how like instantaneously like his music just shifts like when
Hmm.
they get together.
Hmm.
Like, like live at Birdland when he's playing Afro Blue, like
Hmm.
there's this like new level of intensity and like determination in it that, you know, you just know he's like going off somewhere because it's like this very, strong like spirit and energy kind of moving through it. And then I think, a love with a love supreme, which is,
Hmm.
the classic John Coltrane album, this, gift to God or whatever. And one of the arguments that I'm kind of going for in the book is you're a year into this relationship with this woman, you know, and you've written a love supreme that's for God, but I'm like, but isn't it also for your
Right.
wife as well?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
if I'm 1 year into my marriage and I make the this towering, Washington Monument, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's for love and like my love of God, and oh yeah, no, not my wife. No,
Yeah.
that's
Well, she
you know.
how strong was her at that point when they're together, even when they start playing together, when the classic quartet goes away, and then he gets a little further out. How strong was the Eastern spiritual thread for her at that time? She hadn't met Swami Shankanath.
No, yeah, she
You're
hadn't
gonna
met
have to help me with
Satyabinandi.
you're gonna have to help me with these
Uh,
names.
Yeah. I mean, again, John, is a very like deep thinker and like, seeker. And so he's turning over every stone, so to speak, and some of his like most iconic works, it's really taken from like Indian music, and he's really getting into like Ravi Shankar and these sorts of things. And in these other cultures, you don't have to dig far before the music is like butting up against like a
Mhm.
deep spiritual base. Like it's not distinct. It's
Mhm.
and I'm sure Ravi Shankar would be the same way. He's not like, oh, I'm just doing this music and then, over here is my spirit, it's
Mhm.
this expression of his spirituality. And so I think that really resonates for John. And he goes deep, deep into, and examining all of it. And I think one of his things was like, it's weird to think that what I believe is right, but what this other guy thinks is wrong, that doesn't make sense to me. And so he validates like all these different aspects of religious thought and like, sex or whatever, because, this the spiritual, I guess, metaphor is, yeah, there's many ways to, climb the mountain, but when you're at the top, all of them, all these different paths lead to the same place, and same with like when people talk about like science and spirituality is, you're going to get to the same place regardless, right? Like at the top of the mountain, it's all one, and it only seemed like different things. And, because of her religious upbringing as well, I think they just were very simpatico in that. And, we're reading these things together and like trying to understand these things together. And so I think that was, you know, a big aspect for her. And I think, when he passed away, you know, then your faith is really kind of put to the test, right? Like
Right. Well,
it's
that's
one
a
it's one thing to believe in God when everything's going great. It's another thing to,
well, she seemed to go in the opposite. I just want to talk about, when she started playing with him, it wasn't widely critically embraced, correct? Or
yeah, because I think, there was, it was a big successful band. It was a great band. And I think, and always questing and always seeking, you're never like resting on your laurels. You're always like, well,
right,
what's the next thing? Where else can I go? And and it makes sense because it's you're in a plane and you're going up higher, there's turbulence and you have this like disruption of things to take it somewhere else. And I mean, I think that was kind of part of it. And and I don't think he, necessarily knew what was next.
right,
He's like, I've gotten rid of the steady time, I've gotten rid of the chord changes, I've gotten rid of like just playing the melody. And so I think he was really in search of, well, what's the next thing?
right.
And he passes away, and then you will see this like kind of flowering of these other things of like obviously what she was doing, but Pharoah Sanders' solo work,
Hmm.
just any of the impulse canon, or as it turned into like spiritual jazz, and you could kind of see these different, manifestations of it in
Yeah.
like the late 60s, 70s.
Well,
You see this other aspect that he himself, didn't get to the mountaintop.
but she did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he passes away, and it's for those who don't know, I mean, she leaves him with four very young children, right? And to deal with his legacy. So she really does go through, she gets very deep into, she has a depression,
Hmm.
she has astral travels, fasting, losing, so she goes really deeply into there, and she has to, again, control his legacy, what's going to
Hmm.
come out, and then creates her. So for those who don't know, I mean, he had this house in Dix Hills, which I've been to. I used to live out in Long Island, drove by it,
Hmm.
and he had built a recording studio in the basement.
Yeah, it was in the process, so he didn't live
Yeah.
to see it
No, he didn't
finished.
live to see it. Like, and like so did
So
like
not
half
only
the.
did she have to raise the four kids and get them to school and, manage his legacy she also has to finish building the studio, and I think along the way learns how to do audio engineering and
Yeah.
record. She
Yeah, and
learns all of this
and
stuff.
a lot of her early albums were done there, and then there's the harp, which he had ordered for her, which
Hmm.
I always thought she was. I actually did talk to Brandy Younger. I did an interview with her earlier, who
Hmm.
I think is in. She, I think that's the harp she presently
Yeah,
recorded on.
Brandy
Yeah,
does
yeah,
presently own
yeah.
that Lion and Healy harp. So,
Yeah. So, but that's something that really came
eh,
about after his death,
yeah. And what
correct?
did Brandy say about it? Like, because she probably knows more about the harp's history than even I do. So,
We didn't really talk much. I mean, I talked to her about her work but
hmm.
I mean, she's just enthusiastic. I mean, that's not even the word to say it. Just to be in possession of this instrument is just,
Hmm.
you know, a
And
remarkable
I
thing.
think, her style is also a very self-taught style, Alice. And
Yeah,
she didn't go and study harp as I turned up in my research.
right.
So she was very much like just finding her way on it and trying to, so she has this, decidedly not like technical classical approach to playing it. She's
Mm,
very like, you know, does a lot of the runs and just like the, kind of ripples of sound. That's one of her
right.
like, styles and in terms of the harp is, not so much like
Yeah,
really classical, finger picking of it. Just, she
right.
does like her own like iteration of it.
Well, how did her music develop over this time? Like, let's say those, from those early trio albums, and then they became like I think the first album I had was World Galaxy in vinyl, so
Hmm.
that's very heavily orchestrated. She became, very much known for that. And then further on, she moved into, I don't know how you say it,
The
Bajan,
Budgeons,
Bajans.
Budgeons,
Thank you very much.
Budgeons. Yeah. Yeah, I
And
think,
what are some of your favorite pieces, albums
oh
and things
man,
within that?
that's
I mean, they're all great. I think I reviewed the Carnegie Hall one that came out last year. That was a great one too.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just really fascinating because, there's so much growth on those records. Like, I think, I love like Huntington Ashram Monastery, and a monastic trio, but those are also very like tentative. She's really kind of feeling her way out
Hmm.
and, trying to figure out what she's doing. And then, Ptah, that's another one that's, has a structure to it. And then I think around the time that she starts, spending time with Swami Satchidananda and, starts recording Journey in Satchidananda, there's for me, like a real shift in that. Like,
Right.
the intellectual aspect of it, I think, and you can always kind of hear this as sort of this like she's trying to have a more emotional expression on these albums, like the piano trio stuff that she's doing. It doesn't really sound like what other piano trios are up to
No.
at that time. It's, you know, you could say it's rambling. It's just sort of her sort of like feeling out the space and, kind of just going wherever she's going in her like mind or whatever.
And then
Um,
her work also changed in terms of, she got into this Wurlitzer organ sound and then
right.
ultimately would get into synthesizers to kind of
Yeah, yeah.
emulate that, I guess, the soprano or the tenor or whatever. But, she developed in that direction too.
Yeah, I think it gave her like a freedom, like with the Wurlitzer, to kind of really get to these like, kind of sounds she's hearing in her like meditation or
Right.
in her like, in her inner, questing. Like, especially something like universal consciousness, I think is very much in like, she's really trying to reach these sounds that in
Well, she
her
was,
like,
as you say, I think you say in there, she was kind of new age. I don't know if you said it that way, but she was new age before there was new age, really.
right, right.
That was the kind of sound that she was going to. So her life, as her life progresses, she gets more into. She ultimately becomes a Swamini,
Hmm.
and how do you pronounce her name? Tur, Tur,
Swamini Turiya Sangeetananda.
thank you very much. Turiya.
Korea.
And that's a beautiful album. Turiya Sings is
Hmm.
that's a very so she ends up she does a lot of travel to India, study meditation, and then she ultimately creates her own center. She can tell us a little
Right.
bit about that.
Yeah, she's, in her meditations and in her like, in her inner voyaging, so to speak, and she does devote quite a lot of time to meditation. Like she is goes deep into it, and in almost everything, every decision is based in what comes to her in the meditation,
Right,
you know. And so she's receiving these messages that are like, do you need to move to California? And she's
right.
like, yep, and moves to California, and while she's there, receives this vision where she, is initiated as, a Swamini, which is, on top of all the other incredible stuff, like this is a really, that's like me being like waking up and being like, I'm now a Catholic priest. Like you
Right.
really can't do that. Like that's, kind of skipping these steps. And there's a part where, even Swami Satchidananda, they haven't seen each other for a few
Mm.
years and they meet up and even he's like, oh my God, like you are also, like me now. Like I didn't
Yeah.
even like realize it. And
Yeah.
which was like really fascinating. And I think one of the things even that got me into her story many, many years ago was I was talking to, her great nephew, Flying Lotus, Steve
Hmm.
Ellison. And this was, late, you know, I want to say 2009, 2011, like that sort of time. And he's telling me these stories about going to India with her in the 90s. And, people on the street will just like drop down and like bow to her and
Hmm.
like touch her feet. And I had been to India and I was like, you can't just put on an orange robe and go out and do that. Like,
No.
they know if you are the real deal. And I
Right.
was, because I'd always heard like, okay, she's like Santana. She's like, dudes that had gurus, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's easy to kind of conflate her journey with like, Western rock star sort of spiritual journeys, like, oh,
Hmm.
they have a guru, and then they're like, oh, maybe not, and they go back to whatever they're doing. But when he told me that, I remember just being like, that's different. Like she's not, trying something on. Like
Right.
she has really gone the full,
Well, you
you know.
talk in here about there's a segment where you talk about the power to absorb karmic consequences, that she kind of had this develop this power
Mhm.
later in life. But if you
Right.
kind of want to explain what that's about.
I mean, that's getting into the more esoteric aspect of her.
Which is actually one of the more interesting parts of the book. I mean,
Yeah,
I do book reviews of music. I read them all, and that's I mean the everything about the analysis and of the music is fantastic, and the narrative storytelling about a life. But this is sort of something that goes above and beyond. So
right. And there's a certain part, as I was saying, is like, oh, it's like a, Detroit history, and then it's like a love story. And then there's a certain part of the book as well. When I was writing, I was like, this is no longer a music biography. Like all of this is now really secondary to who she really is. And it's more like, the story of a saint, the story of a holy person, the story of someone who's, yeah, there's a part where she meets like Mother Teresa. And again, it's
right, that's great.
like meeting like.
Mm.
And yeah, it was just like that was like a really kind of special thing in that sort of way. Um, and some of the self-published books by her students, they go a lot more into like that sort of teaching and
And
stuff. And they have a,
her own
yeah,
books too. She,
and they
yeah.
have a much better like understanding and insight to it than, even I would. I mean, they sat at her feet and studied with her, from 4 o'clock in the morning,
Yeah.
and lived at her ashram or what have you. And
Like 50 people living at one time there, right?
yeah, it was quite a vibrant community at the time, and like it's just like a really special place. And yeah, so it's like I wanted the book to kind of, as much as I could, kind of talk on it without. I mean, she also wrote these like books like Divine Revelations and Endless Wisdom, and those go far beyond, whatever my area of expertise
Right.
is in a way.
Yeah.
And so,
I get kind of lost in
and
the language too.
yeah, and
Well,
I hope
one thing you also do touch on, which I don't know if you're probably aware, but are you aware that Eternity's Pillow is on Criterion?
yes, Eternity's
Okay.
Pillar. Yeah,
So
yeah.
talk about that. That was a television show she did, a cable show.
Yeah, it was, and this is pretty fascinating because yeah, it was, she gets into public access television, and like many of the things that she learned, she's like, I'm gonna meditate and I'm gonna learn like all the things that I have to do to make a television show. And she does, and she, gets these people to kind of, help with this thing. And yeah, at the time is like I had a friend who'd sent me the 4 episodes, and those are known to be the only ones. And then I think, kind of when the Hammer Museum exhibition opened last year, they had it showing, and that was on Criterion.
Hmm.
Um, and at the time, I was believed like those are the only episodes. And now,
Oh, there
um,
are more. Yeah,
yeah,
because
because she made like 25 or something.
right.
And I had someone recently connect with me, and they had found, not all of them, but a lot more. And I think later this year, there's going to be a set that's like all of as many of them as they found. So I think
Wow.
it's like 17 to 20. And, I think there's an episode with Reverend O.C. Wright, who, was a soul singer who became a minister,
Hmm.
and so she's having a conversation with him in one of the episodes. Um, one of the ones that I've heard about, but they haven't found yet, is one with her and Richie Havens, because
Mm.
she's also like has a connection with like Richie Havens.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and so, so and it was funny because I think they emailed me like right I was in the final edit of the book,
Hmm.
and in the book I was like, there's
Yeah.
only these 4 episodes, and I was like, hold up,
Wait.
and I like deleted all that, and I think in the footnotes I'm like, yeah, there are more, and they're going to be coming out. So,
Well, what you're saying is at the end, there was about a 25-year period where, let's say the spirituality, she was not really very present publicly, musically, but she
mhm.
did do these recordings that were released on cassette. And is that the Ecstatic Music Collection, the two records that just came out? The music she would record at her, I guess it was at her weekend.
At the ashram.
Yeah, at the ashram.
You're speaking about like the Walkabout set or something else?
I think it's called, let's see, I was just listening. It's called The Ecstatic Music of Alice Coltrane, Turiya,
Sangeetananda.
World Spirituality Classics. Came out in
Yeah, yeah.
2017.
Yeah, those are based on the ashram tapes,
Hmm.
and like the 4 main ones that were released, and sold like kind of in new age bookstores or at the
Hmm.
ashram in their bookstore. Like that compilation kind of pulls from those 4 recordings.
Hmm.
Um, and funny enough, actually, Turiya Sings is not on that set because
Right, that's
I think
great.
originally they were going to do that as a standalone, and then it didn't really happen, and Impulse put out a different version of it, and
Yeah. Is that the one she cut at the studio with Guns N' Roses when Guns N' Roses was next?
uh
I love stuff like that. Those are the like,
yeah, it's
Fleetwood Mac was recording Rumors and she was recording something in the next room.
yeah, and like Lord of Lords, and then yeah,
Yeah.
the when I heard the one about Guns N' Roses, and it was just yeah, it was really funny because I remember the Guns N' Roses song where you can hear the woman having an orgasm in it, and to be like, No, wait, just down the hall is like the most like wonderful like spiritual music of all time. It's like
That's
it's
Los
just a
Angeles.
very
That's Los
yeah, that's
Angeles
Los
for for you.
that sure is.
So,
Um
yeah. So, she also did have her. I don't know if John Jr. was her eldest son. Was he her eldest
yeah,
son?
John
Yeah.
Jr. was their first son together.
Right. And
She has
he,
a daughter from the first marriage
right.
who John sort of, you know, adopted, so to speak. I don't
Right.
know if,
Yeah.
legally that all happened, but that was
Yeah.
basically the father that she knew.
Yeah. And then you
Um,
also reference in there an album that she recorded with her sons, which has not seen the light of day, or
yeah,
with
there
Ravi
are
and
recordings with all three of the boys because they kind
yeah.
of did it just to kind
Yeah.
of, I think, kind of making a demo to shop around, and then
Right.
obviously when he passed, that was all kind of put on hold.
Yeah. So Ravi is kind of now that she's passed, Ravi is kind of running the show, or
Yeah, it's kind of Ravi and Sita Michelle are
he's the
the,
Dweezil. He's the Dweezil.
yeah, and I think,
Hopefully not as bad as the Zappa. I just actually talked to Moon. I did an interview with her about her memoir, her Mommy
hmm.
Dearest, or
Oh
Daddy
wow, yeah,
Dearest.
that's
Well, it was really more Mommy Dearest than Daddy Dearest, but needless.
yeah, and I think it's been, I don't want to say, they've been blindsided, but just maintaining the John Coltrane legacy, the
Right,
recorded works, like that's already a full-time, decades-long endeavor.
right.
And so in the last 10 years, you've had this entirely other, you know, heretofore like kind of unrecognized aspect of Alice's work, which I
Right.
think the family is still kind of, sorting out and figuring out how to handle it because Robbie's basis is in jazz and the jazz tradition, and that's the legacy that he wants to uphold.
Right.
But, the spiritual, the new age aspect of it, that's kind of a different creature in a way, and it's a much more personal aspect.
And you were also speaking about her influence on people like Radiohead and Bjork, and
Hmm.
so she does her seems like it's her time now, a bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you have,
So,
obviously would have been unthinkable in the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, even the 2000s. But you have like a generation of people now that know her work. They don't know
right.
his,
Right. Yeah.
because you can listen to John stuff and it's jazz and it's in the jazz tradition. And
Right.
she's speaking to, this, unseen plateau, this vista that, they
Hmm.
haven't, no one, people hadn't gotten to at that time, right?
Right.
So at the time she was doing it, it was, whatever, out to lunch or, you know, rambling or incoherent, whatever the critical slings she had to sort of undergo. And I think now you have this like generation that doesn't have these same
Hmm.
confines of genre and like thinking about things in certain like pockets. Like they're able to kind of see the vision better and like understand the vision kind of better than, maybe at the time when it was released. So,
Right. And again, she had an enormous shadow to deal with in terms of her husband.
mhm.
So maybe
And
that
even her
interests you.
talking about it, she always talked about him. Like
Yeah.
even, it's hard to find interviews where she's kind of talking about her work. She's
Right.
really able to kind of talk about him and his legacy and what he did. You know, Herself, she was deflected more and was, I think at the time it was also kind of, not appreciated and, people weren't really seeking her out for that. They wanted to know about John,
Right. Where
that
is
sort
there
of way.
more? Yeah. Well, again, the book is if you want to tell it, The Life and Art and Transcendence of Alice Coltrane, Cosmic Music. I'm sure you can probably pre-order it now. We're
Yeah.
speaking in February, but this will be probably, coming
Yeah,
out.
it can be ordered through the Hachette website, anywhere you're getting books from, whether it's, Amazon, or you have a local shop you go to, and you can pre-order it sort of anywhere. I've had a lot of folks just be like, yeah, you can just go to the bookstore that's down the street and pre-order it that way. So
Go ask for it at the bookstore down the street. That's how we do
yes,
it. Well, thank you so
exactly.
much for your time, and all the best of luck with it. And we look forward to what you're doing, what you'll be coming up with next. And
All right,
thanks
thank you,
again, buddy.
Sal. Yeah, man.
Hold on.
Okay.